One of our friends, said something that's just shaped us. She said, belonging is not just something that you find, but belonging is something that you bring.
Wow.
And I know that's just helped reshape something, even conversations we have with people where it's like sometimes we're waiting for something to come to us, and that's great when it does. But if we understand that, no, we do belong, like we understand our worth, our value, we can bring belonging.
Welcome to Capture the Thought. Today we have another exciting episode for you as we're joined by Chris and Julie Bennett, who are pastors at Vintage Church in Malibu, California. They're also writers and content producers. They have recently written a book called Fighting for Family, which is a great read. I would highly recommend it. Welcome, Chris and Julie, to Capture the Thoughts. It is so great to have you here. So how are you guys doing? How have you been?
And we've been great. I mean, here we are on the other side of the world, and this is such a gift to get to be with you and all of your listeners today, truly.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for having us, Grace.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. The pleasure is all ours. So as our audience know by now that you have written a book called Fighting for Family, and you really seem to have a heart for families. You also have a podcast as well. And so what drew you to this kind of ministry? Why are you so concerned and involved when it comes to families?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think from a faith perspective, we're both followers of Jesus. And I think as we have gotten to know more of who God is as a father and his heart for people, there's kind of an anchor verse in Psalm 68, verse 5 through 6, that says, Father to the fatherless, defender of widows, he places the lonely in families. One translation says he puts the lonely in homes. And I think that language has been very meaningful to us, and through our own experiences of what we went through in our own marriage, and then since moving to LA from a land called Oklahoma, far, far away, not as far as Zimbabwe, but we started to discover, God designed us to do life together. None of us were made to do life alone. And through COVID, it just kind of accentuated what I think was already there, which was nobody thrives in isolation. And there was the U.S. Surgeon General put out a report about a year ago. It was an 85-page document, and the title was Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. And kind of what we're realizing is it's the most connected generation because we can do amazing things like this virtually, and we can get on Instagram and all the things. But there's a loneliness that people are living in. So we've just tried to, writing this book was, whether you're married, whether you're single, divorced, whatever your situation, we believe we were made for family. And for many people, their family is their chosen family as much as it is their family of origin. And family can be really painful for a lot of people because their experiences. So in writing this, we just kind of brought some principles that we've learned to help people overcome barriers that kind of keep you from experiencing healthy family.
Because, family can be a trigger word for so many people. Wow, I experienced my greatest pain. I've experienced abuse. I've experienced A, B, C, D. You go down the list. And it's really a choice that we come up to over and over again in life. It's like a crossroads. Like, I want family, whether, again, as he said, chosen family. Maybe it's, maybe you didn't grow up with parents. Like, there's so many different stories and histories that we have, but we're asking the question, I'm at a crossroads. I know I'm made for it, but do I want to go down that road again? We describe in the intro of our book, I know you said you read it just as like you think of family as a mountain, and you're like, I've tasted and I've seen the views at the top. It's so gorgeous. It's so amazing, but I've toppled down so many times. To climb that again, is it worth it? And we wrote this book with just the hopes that people would go, wow, no, it is worth it. And if you've forgotten that it's worth it, like, we wanted to give you some things to help you, because it's not a formula, it's different. And discovery is hard, but yeah, go ahead. Did you want to say something? Oh, yeah.
That's amazing. And you're doing such amazing work. So just back to the contents of your book. You mentioned your journey and how you moved to Los Angeles, and then Julie, you were just diagnosed with cancer, and this was during the pandemic. And I just found it interesting. How did you keep your sanity during that time? Because moving is stressful enough, and then it's just one thing after the other. How did you go through that? How did you navigate that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I remember the first time I was asked that question, I almost was stunned for a minute thinking, why can't I answer this question? And I think it's because what I believed about God became very real during that time. Like we talk about his grace is sufficient for us in our weakness. Now we read those things and we may choose to believe those things. We go, well, and then we go in through what might be the hardest thing in our life up to a certain point and we go, do I believe that? Like, is that actually going to be true? And we came up again, I've used the word crossroads here twice now, but just this thing of like, are we going to stay where people have kind of thought we're crazy? Like, you can go back to something that's not as hard. I mean, you have a cancer, but at least you can go
Mm.
and have a home that you owned and things. And now you're going to choose to stay in LA, one of the most disconnected cities in the world, where you really don't know anyone. And how I stayed sane was I chose to believe that if God says he is who he is, then it doesn't promise that things are going to be easy. Life is extremely difficult. There's a lot of suffering. There's a lot of hard and mystery. But what the Bible promises is that he never changes, like his character. And I had experienced enough in my walk with God. We had experienced enough as a family. And we had 4 kids. We still have 4 kids. Um, and so there's 6 of us in LA now with a cancer diagnosis, and we now have no home. So a part of that story too was we had sold our home, so we were going to have some money, and then the people backed out, and we were already in LA. So we had a lot of things piled on top of one another. And so I had to go back to Joshua 4, I think it was maybe 4:9. And when God did one of the greatest miracles, and I'm not going to go into all of it for the sake of time, but they had laid out memorial stones, 12 stones. It's like, why are we doing this? It's because we forget when it gets hard. We forget the
Mhm.
things of God and who he is. So there were a reminder. So when their children, wondered like, well, is God going to come through? Well, remember what he did then and the next generation. And
Yeah.
we came to this place where I was like, God's always been faithful. And the road's not going to be easy, but he's going to meet us and his grace will be sufficient. And that's what he did in the
Wow.
midst of a hard. And we now have more what I would call memorial stones to put down. Here's how he's faithful. Oh, did it get easier? Nope. He just became, we experienced joy because of who he was for us.
And can I maybe tag on to that? And I'm not speaking for Julie, but I'll just say where I think why we wrote this book was life is hard. I mean, we don't get a pass on the hard, we just don't, and we get grace to go through the hard, but we don't necessarily get a pass on it. And I think the way we were able to make it through and not lose our sanity or whatever you want to call it is because we had each other.
Mhm.
There's a proverb that says, family sticks together through all kinds of trouble. And I think what we
Mhm.
feel a burden for is people that don't have that, that are going through hard alone. It's hard enough to go through hard together. It is nearly impossible to go through hard alone. And so we really want to help people understand that family's possible, that you can find a sense of belonging wherever you are. And we have a friend who, during the pandemic, we invited like 3 of our single friends over who are in their 20s, 30s, I think one maybe in her early 40s. And we were saying, we've been married since we were 21. Like, we don't fully understand what it's like to be a single and do life. What does family look like for you? And one of our friends, said something that's just shaped us. She said, belonging is not just something that you find, but belonging is something that you bring.
Wow.
And I know that's just helped reshape something, even conversations we have with people where it's like sometimes we're waiting for something to come to us, and that's great when it does. But if we understand that, no, we do belong, like we understand our worth, our value, we can bring belonging. And so we had a single in our church that was in her late 40s, never been married, didn't have kids, and she basically said she was coming to church week after week. I pastor a church in Malibu, California. And we really try and create community and belonging. That's like one of our things we really try and do well. But her experience was she was coming every week and found herself standing all by herself and nobody engaging with her. And she could have been angry and just left and said, whatever with the church. But she met me for coffee. And she said she went back and prayed and said, God, what do I do? And she felt God told her to go back to church and find the people that are standing by themselves that don't have belonging and bring it to them. And I was
Wow.
like, that's it. Like that place of intentionality. And now she's in our community. She's in a small group that we have. And so just believe it's for everybody.
Wow, that is so amazing. Just to pick up from that, I know that in America there's probably the loneliness epidemic, right? What we do have is a lot of families breaking down because moms or parents are going to the diaspora because of the economic pressures here. And that separation can really feel, very much isolating. And so just to understand, how would you navigate that? How do you move through that as someone who's experiencing separation, who's experiencing loss or alienation?
Mm. Oh,
Yeah,
question.
wow, that's a really good
It's a
question.
really good question.
I mean, I think the
Trying to think.
first thing we do, I mean, I think empathy is a big deal where I think, Jesus empathizes with us in our weaknesses. And I think, we look at his life and we see that he was drawn towards the marginalized and the isolated, and we read this scholar recently that said, Jesus was killed for who he had dinner with, meaning like he was so intentional about finding people that didn't have a place to belong and bring it to them, but he did it out of empathy and compassion. His miracles were not self-promotion. They were out of, genuine compassion. So I think, the first thing I would say, because it's hard to relate to somebody who's in the position you're describing for me personally, but to say, how do we find those that are experiencing that and come around them in their time of need? We have several single moms in our church, and we're just thinking through like, okay, how do we bring them into a sense of family, and based on their situation and circumstance. And I think what Julie's, maybe you could speak to this, has helped me is just giving people permission to
I was
grieve.
about to say that.
So yeah, maybe you could,
No, go ahead.
yeah, just recognizing where you are. You don't want to stay where you are, but that grief's a real thing, and feeling your grief is a real thing.
Yeah, I think the thing I could, as much as I could relate, which is maybe not a lot, I did experience when we left, we felt separated from our family. And yes, it was a choice. But when we chose to go through the hardest stretch of our lives in so many ways, we felt at times a sense of anxiety, at times a sense of like, we're making this choice. And again, not everybody is making that choice. They don't have a choice, but to be
Mm,
separated to make it. And I understand that. Um, but we had to go through learning like the importance of vulnerability, not as just a good idea.
mm,
But in our vulnerabilities of life, and then even the vocalization of our vulnerabilities, it does something and draws us together and helps heal some of
that's
those
good.
deep places. And so part of that was us as a family. Our kids went through a lot because they were separated from everything they had ever known. They had grown up in Oklahoma. So again, we went from the state of Oklahoma to the state of California, and those are very different here in America, very
Mhm.
different cultures even, and so um we had to learn how to recognize how we were feeling. And I think the world is talking a lot about like, I would call it here like good therapy language and like dealing with our emotions and how we feel. But there really is something to that, I think, that God is honing in on. And so I'm going to take this to a story with my daughter, who I had to pull out of school a year and a half ago because this separation anxiety was so high for her because she
Mm,
almost lost her mom. So had a traumatic. So some of maybe the people
yeah.
where you're at and that you're speaking of is they actually feel a bit of trauma based on there's nothing else that we can do. This family member has to go and do this so that we can make it, right? Like,
Mm,
am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, yeah.
So it's for my daughter, it's mom has to be rushed to the hospital right now or she's not going to make it. Our family's not going to make it. This is the middle of COVID. They didn't think I would make it through the night. And she is traumatized as an 8-year-old. Even though mom is fine and a year has gone by, she finds herself going, that the fear of losing my mom, even though I didn't lose my mom and she's still here, created something in her that she just tucked away because we repress. That's how we protect ourselves. And
Mhm.
she's now going, I have such separation anxiety from this traumatic event, even though time has passed and everyone is telling me it's going to be okay. I am still left. So she could choose to either keep that in and go, nope, be strong, be strong. That's what we do. Or go, I'm actually
Mm.
needing a space to go, I don't feel okay, even though the circumstances have changed. And so we had to create space as a family around her. So maybe in the culture that you're in and the situations families and individuals are in with the separation, is we have to go, I'm feeling really scared right now. I'm feeling a lot of grief. And we make space to feel the emotions that God has given us, but we don't let those emotions overtake us. And there's a difference. And that's when our relationship with the Father comes in. Okay, I'm recognizing this, but I'm not going to stay there because here's who he says he is for me. But if I don't recognize them, then I can tend to spiral backwards. So I'll pause there. I could say a lot on that, but we're walking through that and learning how to heal from what separation does to us,
Mm.
even our psyche and our souls.
Mm, that is so true. Thank you for sharing that. And there's another aspect of this. There are people who are part of dysfunctional families, or families that are just toxic, families that cause tend to cause an emotional strain. And so, what advice would you give to someone who comes from such a family? Maybe they've closed themselves off to people, or they think that families are just bad. So
Yeah, I mean,
how
no,
would
Good
I would
question.
you speak to them?
almost think, I'm sorry, Grace. Yeah, I think as we've worked with people since we were teenagers, I would almost say everyone has some sort of a negative experience with something that was intended to be family for them. It could have been their family of origin that they grew up in. It could have been a church, that was like, well, they said they're, we've experienced so much pain in church leadership, that we've worked through. So I think one, it's recognizing, I think we all have some of those pains within us. I think one of the things we wrote about in the book is just about boundaries. And I think sometimes we can, almost have to be careful of saying like, yeah, not everybody is meant to be family forever. Somebody maybe played a role that was a certain space that was needed in a particular season. But if that becomes toxic, obviously, if it's unhealthy situations, one is, the hope is if it's healthy enough, you can work towards reconciliation and maybe there is a continued relationship, but that's not always the case. And we have friends that, during the pandemic, they were one of our good friends and his parents became very opposite sides on, something like politics. And it actually became this massive dividing force in their relationship. And you should say, well, it should never come to that. But because of the toxic nature of what started to happen, they needed space. And so we think boundaries are really important. And sometimes boundaries are so that we can just get to a place of health and saying, okay, I got to get to a healthier place personally. And anytime I'm around this person, this situation, this group, it's actually not helping me, it's hurting me. So yes, boundaries is vital. Forgiveness is a huge part that we talk a lot about in our own journey, but also helping people understand forgiveness is as much for us as it is for the person who offended us.
Mm,
Forgiveness is so that our hearts can stay soft, and we can continue to stay in relationships. But if somebody
Love
hurt
that.
us, abused us, that forgiving them, I think sometimes we could think, well, we're letting them off the hook. They need their, consequence, and realizing, it's not really our job, to deal with their consequence. Ultimately, God takes care of those things. But healthy boundaries, forgiveness, and forgiveness doesn't mean you have to stay in a relationship with that person. And we have
mhm,
people that, we're family,
Many
and
times it's not,
yeah,
because it's not, yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So I just think those are really important. And so I would just tell anybody listening, if you're in a toxic, relationship that's not helping you get to a place of health, then yeah, absolutely. You need to probably give yourself permission to evaluate whether or not you need to continue in that relationship. Anything you'd add?
Yeah, I think, trying to think on it. I think when I think so much of when we think about, I mean, I have a background of abuse, sexual abuse, and different things. And then because I didn't work through those things, I brought that in my marriage. And we write about that in the book, which created betrayal and lots of things, then left lots of room to learn how to forgive, which is really difficult to do, even if it's the right thing to do. Um, it's a really hard concept for a lot of us that have been deeply wounded, specifically in toxic relationships. And I realized my lack of being able to not only bring some really toxic and abusive things to the surface so that I could heal was because I didn't believe I was worthy to have boundaries. I didn't believe I was worthy to heal. And really, until we can go, I can see myself in the way that God sees me. Like on my worst day, whether something was done to me or whether I chose to do something that was toxic for someone else, whichever side of the coin, I still have to go. On my worst day, God sent his son Jesus to die, especially as we come up here on Easter, so that he covered the things where I felt the most disconnected, where I felt the most unworthy. And on my worst day, he still sees me through the cross. That's why he came. That's why he died. And when I can understand, that doesn't mean there's not consequences. It doesn't mean there's not things to work through and there's not boundaries. It's when I am able to see myself and tap into that place, then I am able to go, no, I don't deserve to continue to get beat down and abused by someone. No, I am worthy to get healing. I am worthy to seek reconciliation, boundaries, but it has to start there because until I did, God doesn't impose my will. He invites me into something more. And that's the gift he gives us. It's a free will. So he's going, you have to believe what I came here to die for. I can't make you believe that. And once I took that step, slowly but surely, again, a longer conversation for another time, I wasn't able to go, oh no, that person doesn't get to have power over me and continue to destroy my life. I'm forgiving them to release them to the Lord, not to be their best friend, not even to be family with them. I'm releasing them to God, and then thus releases myself.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for opening up about that, Julie. I know a lot of people tend to stay in abusive situations because they're afraid of being alone and they're afraid of stepping out into the unknown.
It's scary. It is very scary. That's very real.
Yeah.
And we serve a God who understands those feelings. Again, it's about recognizing it. I'm terrified. But true confession is just telling the truth about where we're at. And then we get to repent, which means just bringing like God changing the way we think. So it's not just, I'm sorry, or I should have gotten out of that. It's like, that doesn't change anything. Remorse is not repentance. It's, I am terrified. I don't feel worthy. I'm scared. It is such honesty with a really good father, even if our earthly father was not in the picture, it was not a good person. Our heavenly father is. So we're just telling the truth. And then he's going, let me change the way you think. And when he changes the way we think about it, then we can have transformation. Anyway,
Good.
I'll pause there.
That's very good. And for people who have maybe who are in community, perhaps with people who are broken and who are traumatized, how do we embrace them? How do we bring them in? Because they're not always deemed easy to deal with, or they are sometimes deemed as being difficult, but they also have a need for family and they also have a need for community. How then do we bring them in and also walk with them through that healing process?
Question.
It's a good question. You know, perfect family doesn't exist. A perfect father does, and even that is hard to understand at times for our hearts and minds, but for perfect family doesn't. But we really believe that healthy family can. So, you know, I think we write this in the book, but human plus human equals human problems, right? And so even on our best days, when we're bringing all of ourselves to the relationship, we still have a host of issues that we're working through, thought patterns, behaviors that need to change. And we're all bringing that to the table, some healthier than others. And I think it comes back to a grace that is given, that is the same grace extended to us in our relationship with God. I'm going to seek to understand before being understood. These little things we practice. You know what? I'm going to think about how can we talk about honor. Like, I want to see who you are without stumbling over what you're not. And if I practice these principles, they remove barriers to building belonging and going, we actually all have a host of issues because we're human. God meets us in that. How can I meet this individual? Again, that meeting someone where they're at doesn't mean that you have to have dinner with them every week. It doesn't mean that you have to become their best friend. It's valuing the human in front of you that was created by God. And knowing how to just be honest with where we're at with each other really creates something healthy in a way that if we just try to control people because we're afraid, and how relationship should be. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think a practical thing, I mean, Jules, all that is right on. And I think, again, to look at what Jesus did, which was the ability to bring people together that didn't agree with each other, that came from very different backgrounds. There's a couple passages where Jesus is getting ridiculed for he's being called a drunkard and a glutton because who he would dine with, and around a table he's got tax collectors who are so incredibly hated and despised because of the way they took advantage of people. He had a zealot, and they would literally were known for murdering tax collectors. You have, what would be the modern day, sex workers, because they said the outcasts of society. So you're talking about this hodgepodge of people from all different backgrounds that brought all their mess to the table. And I think there's something that if we can get over ourselves a little bit and say, I'm going to be okay with a messy table, meaning like I'm going to bring people together that are different than me, and I don't have to agree with them. But I know we're in America and you're in a Zimbabwe, but I don't know what it's like there. But I know that there's this whole narrative that you have to agree with someone for you to love them. And I don't think agreement is a prerequisite to love. I think, um, you know, Jesus loved everybody right where they are. So I would just encourage anybody that, it doesn't mean, like Julie said, you have to do a weekly dinner, but man, pull some people together, invite people into your home that are very different than you, and make it the only goal is I want to understand their perspective, even if I don't agree with it.
We have 5 things that we try to imperfectly practice in our family. And I'll just read those. And it's messy. It's very messy. Seek to understand before being understood. And when we do, we do that by asking intentional questions. Number 2, believing the best about each other, even when we are at our worst. Number 3, having an open and honest conversation. We say no BS allowed. There's none of the bull. We like get that out of the way. That whole true confession, repentance, transformation thing I was talking about. Number 4, working through hard things instead of walking away. Number 5, invite feedback without defense while giving space for the process. It's really hard, but even when it's hard, we fight to create that space for each other.
Wow, I love that. I love how you say we need to be comfortable with having a messy table.
Yeah.
I think that is so important. And I think it's a Christian thing. We tend to, as Christians, we're not always as accommodating as we ought to be because we feel that we're right.
Yep.
We know Jesus and therefore, we can't go wrong. But it's not just about being right. It's about reaching out to the person who may need help or who's lost or all of that.
Well, not to go into a mini
Inconvenient.
sermon, but the message I was preaching yesterday was about hospitality. And in the New Testament, the word hospitality means the love of the stranger. It's literally creating the safe space for people that don't have belonging. Anyway, the story of Zacchaeus in Luke 19 is, he is the chief tax collector. So not only are tax collectors hated, he's the chief of all of them. So the sense I had is like, oh, this guy was very lonely. He was wealthy, had all the money, but he had no one around him. And so he finds Jesus coming through, gets up in a tree so he can see Jesus. And Jesus does not call him out or confront him in his error. He invites him to be in his home. I mean, he basically says, I have to be in your home today. And
Mm.
so that's what I just think, like, oh, if we could get more of that rhythm of like, Jesus knew what this guy was doing. He knew that and what happened is Jesus goes into this guy's home, and immediately Zacchaeus says, I need to give back everything 4 times as much as I was stolen. Well, Jesus, as far as we can tell, never brought it up to him. But when you get in the proximity of that type of love, unconditional love,
Mm.
it's amazing the transformation that someone can experience, opposed to, oh, if I lead with, I'm going to tell you what you're doing wrong, where you believe wrong, where you're living the wrong way, you shut people off. And so I think, man, we could get better at just creating that place. So
Yeah, yeah, that is so true. That is so true. We really need to radiate that. We need to radiate that love. I think it's so important. And so we have been talking on this podcast about identity and purpose with our guests. And I know earlier you touched on how our families tend to have an impact on how we perceive ourselves. And so, what role can a good family, and I'm putting this in quotation marks because no family is perfect, but what role can a good family play in helping its members realize their identity and their purpose, what God made them to be?
Yeah, well, maybe can I jump in and then there's a verse in it's First Peter, I think it's in chapter 4, and it talks about the incorruptible seed of Christ Jesus. And if we understand that, for those of us that are followers of Jesus, we have a seed on the inside of us, and that seed is not only salvation, but it's purpose. It's the thing God designed us to do. And we've often thought of home, and again, whether that's your natural home or whatever the environment where there's a sense of family, to create like what, agriculturally it'd be a greenhouse, and we were at our friend's farm this past week in Tennessee. And so, sometimes it's like snow and freezing temperatures, and other times it's scorching heat or rain. But in the greenhouse, you protect the inside from all the external environments that you cannot control. And so in family, our job is not to control anything. Our job is to create an environment, a culture, so that the seed can grow into what it's designed to do. And so some of the things we wrote about in the book that Jules has mentioned, we've mentioned some of these values of forgiveness and boundaries, and even taking risk and stepping out into things is a culture. And within that culture, we've seen, our kids who are now 20, 18, 15, and 12, which is hard to believe, we're seeing the God purpose inside of them begin to bloom and flourish. They're all so incredibly different. So I would just encourage anybody, like Julie said, it's not about perfect family, but it's like if you walk into a room and you have a thermostat, I don't know what y'all call it, but you set the temperature for that room to create a certain environment. So if it's freezing outside, doesn't matter. You can have this on the inside. I think that's how family is. We're just trying to create a culture, an environment so that healthy things can grow.
Yeah, I say three things or somewhere in the book, I don't know, towards the end it's try to live by like I can't control everything. I will allow myself to be messy around others and my family, and I will also let other people be complicated. And when I give it space for those things, then I can take these principles from the Bible that we're trying to live by as we create belonging and bring them to the table more easily.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And so, do you have any closing words? Any reflections, any words of encouragement that you'd like to share? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think maybe the only reason this book exists is because we have a story that looks very different than we thought it would look when we met at 19. And I heard a quote recently that says, great stories happen to those who can tell them. And great stories aren't the ones that are filled with all the victories and everything worked out the way we thought. Great stories are the ones that have lots of ups and lots of downs and usually are filled with lots of pain. And I think what we can all relate to are the pain points of life. And all of us have gone through hard. Hard is hard, doesn't matter what it looks like compared to the person next to you. And so I would just encourage anybody, part of healing is coming to that place of you're not ashamed of your story anymore. And the way that we actually help people is embracing our story. And because of what we've been through of sickness and an affair and all the things, now people that know our story look to us not as experts, but as people that's like guides. That's how we wrote the book. Hey, we've just been there and we've walked through it and we've come out on the other side. And so I would just give people hope that your story can be, I don't know that I would say rewritten, but rewrited and can be used for really good, even the hard place.
Yeah. I mean, I just, it can feel cliche at times, but at the end of the day, we are all worth belonging. And we're all worth when we've toppled down what feels like a mountain when we think about family and connection. And we're like, oh my goodness, like, how did I get down at the bottom again? And this is too much. And we just believe that you can get back up again, that you were created to. And so yeah, we're just in your corner, way far away here in California. We just believe you're worth it. We want you to hear that. God wants to reveal himself to you in new ways. So don't just ask. And God is amazing at how he reveals. There's no formula, but he will just show up and be faithful when you let him.
Wow, thank you. Oh, Chris, you look like you wanted to add something else.
No, I just wanted to say, Grace, I know we're just getting to know you, but there's something, your name is who you are, and you put people at ease. And I feel like whether you're on the other side of the world or not, you are creating this kind of living room environment for people to feel really safe, and you're bringing in trusted people, and you're helping people more than you even realize. It doesn't matter how many what people listen to the podcast. I'm telling you, there's an exponential impact on the environment and the conversations that you're hosting. So I just want to say thank you.
And whoever's listening, just like Grace is doing, you can do that too. It's not a comparison. You may not be able to write a book or start a podcast, but you may be able just to look a neighbor or a friend or someone on the street in the eye today and say, you're really valuable, and do it with sincerity. The Bible says love must be sincere, not just loving because it's a good idea. When it holds sincerity with no strings attached, there is power behind it to transform every soul that you encounter. So just start little, but you are made for greatness. Even if you're in the middle of the hard, and even if you don't feel worthy, He can still use you.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we have reached the end of the episode. For those who are listening, thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, stay safe. Goodbye.